right now, as we're having this live show here, also live on Capitol Hill right now, there is the House Foreign Affairs Committee holding hearings on what they're calling Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan. And they've got two of their senior former officials in General Mark Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and former General Kenneth McKenzie of the Marine Corps, who was the commander of the ground forces in Afghanistan. I believe it was at the very end when that was over in 2022. I'm sorry, in 2021, in August of 2021. So they've been grilling them for quite a while now. It's been going on since 1 p.m. As you can see on the screen here, that's actually still going on right now. So I'm sure we're going to have more to say on this later. But there's been a number of things that have been said so far that I think bear some analysis. And for those of you who may not know, I was stationed twice in Afghanistan on combat deployments, once in 2005, 2006, and a second time in 2010, 2011. And in fact, one of the first times I popped up on national radar was because in 2012, in February of 2012, I published an article in the Armed Forces Journal, which was subsequently picked up by New York Times, CNN, PBS, several other news nations and outlets, where I called out the senior leaders of both the Pentagon and the Department of State and Department of Defense, who continue to claim to the American people that the war was winning. We were doing a good job. Things were getting better. The Afghan National Security Forces were improving. The Afghan government was becoming less corrupt and more responsible to its people. All this stuff I said was fiction. It was not true. And in fact, about a year and a half before that, in 2010, 2009, and then again in 2010, and also in the Armed Forces Journal, I wrote that if we didn't make major changes in how we were conducting this war, we would lose the war. Now, at the time I wrote that, people just kind of rolled their eyes like the most powerful military on the face of the planet is ever going to lose to an opponent that just has a few thousand fighters, no Air Force, no Navy, no artillery, no tanks, none of that stuff. It was nonsense, they thought. But knowing how insurgent conflicts are fought, and especially knowing the history of Afghanistan, and then knowing what I had seen on the ground, I knew that the risk was high. And during my 2010, 2011 deployment, I saw with my own eyes that that's exactly what was happening. And we, despite what all of our leaders were saying publicly, the truth behind the scenes was disaster was unfolding, and everything I had feared in 2010 was now coming to roost. And it was clear we were moving on the direction to defeat. Now, the hearing that's going on right now, for mainly political reasons here in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans love to blame each other for stuff, and this is no small portion of this. Is that the Republican-led House is wanting to make this sound as bad as possible for the Biden administration as they have since the outset here, and the Democrats are trying to say no, this was actually Trump's fault because a lot of this was said before then, and both sides are having to make a lot of points they're having. But what I'm going to tell you above all, and then I'm going to give you some specific excerpts, and then also some of the things that these guys are saying. This was a 20 years in the making disaster. It was the rot of 20 years of bad policies and lying to you, the American people, that caused this disaster. Now, the way the Biden administration conducted it and handled it was really awful, and they deserve some condemnation and blame for how it was done. The Trump administration also deserves some blame for how this thing went down. The Pentagon leaders, the two men that are testifying there, who everyone's talking to as though they're some deity or something, also deserve a lot of the blame for what happened, because so much of this was avoidable. And so I want to now jump into, we have a handful of clips here we're going to talk about, and then I'm going to give you some other information that they didn't talk about but should have, that was also very instrumental in how this thing went down. First of all, we're going to talk about when they were, I think, now retired General Milley was asked, who made the decision for this and who basically is at fault.
I can't say, the president said this, president said that. That's beyond the scope of the law, actually, with executive privilege. But it's obvious that the president made the decision, and the president made an announcement on the 14th. And every president has a right to make those decisions. He's looking at things from a much wider angle than a military angle. Our military assessment was keep 2,500, and with them, it's not just 2,500. It's 2,500 plus the NATO plus the contractors. Right. And the contractors are key here. And then that, we thought, our assessment was, that would keep the Afghan government, the military, stable until such time as a diplomatic outcome could occur in accordance with the conditions set in the Doha Agreement.
In retrospect, would that have made the difference?
I mean, we'll never know, I guess, because it didn't happen. So I do think, though, that I believe that the Afghan government, the Afghan security forces would not have collapsed in August of 21 had we maintained that posture. Those were high-end special forces capable of defending themselves and conducting operations as they had been for a while. And I think my assessment, probably moderate to significant risk on U.S. forces, but is that worth that risk?
So he repeated something there that he said many times, both at the time and subsequently, that he did not recommend that we get out. So to back up a little bit, in case you're not aware, the whole thing that spawned this withdrawal is that during the Trump administration, he made a deal with the Taliban. It's called the Doha Agreement because that's where it was physically made at, that required the United States to withdraw completely from Afghanistan by May 31st of 2021. That was the agreed upon date. And then there was several things that both sides agreed to. The key one is that the U.S. wouldn't attack the Taliban and the Taliban wouldn't attack the United States. There was a bunch of other things that were in there. Both sides marginally lived up to the other parts of the agreement, but both sides did live up to the agreement not to attack each other. That part that both sides did. And listen, this was, let me just point blank tell you, as I just pointed out, this was 20 years of disaster in the making. It absolutely needed to come to an end because the war would never have been won. And if we hadn't withdrawn then, we would still be there just going through the motions and not even moving towards an attainable objective for the United States. There was no military attainable objective that we could accomplish with any number of forces. It doesn't matter how many we had, how few we had. We did everything all the way up and down from 100,000 down to 2,500 and half a dozen different force levels in between over the years. That was never going to be the issue. The issue was on the ground. The war was physically unwinnable for the United States, just as it had been twice for the British Empire going back into the 1800s, but the Soviets in the 1980s, and us this time. The big powers are not going to go in there and militarily conquer the place for a whole host of reasons. You can read some of the articles that I've written on that in the Armed Forces Journal, which are available online. You can see those, and they're all detailed in there why. But the bottom line is, here you just heard Milley say that if we had kept it 2,500, that he thinks that we could have maintained the base. Well, that's not the objective. The objective wasn't to maintain our position in Afghanistan. If there is no military attainable objective, why do you want to keep any number of troops there? See, no one asked him that question, because this fiction, which he also said in his opening statement, that it meant a lot. There is no doubt in my mind, he said, that this kept our country safe and that we are safer because we were there. No, we weren't. Absolutely not. I can categorically tell you that isn't true, because that's not how we keep our country safe, by having a few troops on the ground in one spot, one little dot on the global map, that somehow that there's something special about the dirt in Afghanistan as opposed to the entire rest of the world. There are terrorist threats to the United States, and there are genuinely people who want to do us harm. And if they have the capacity, they will. They don't have to originate from Afghanistan, and just keeping troops there while the whole rest of the world is not garrisoned by American troops. Obviously, if anybody wanted to do us harm, they would go somewhere else, right? I mean, it's like saying someone's going to rob a bank and they're going to go to the police station to make their plans. Well, of course they're not. They'll go where the police aren't, right? I mean, it's self-evident. It's common sense. So the bad guys are going to be bad guys no matter where they are. So that it was not an objective that the U.S. should have had. If we went to Afghanistan because we believed that Al-Qaeda was there and that they were responsible for 9/11, and we wanted to go teach them a lesson or punish them for it, that's fine. That's what we did. And that's why I've argued many times over the years that if we, by the March, say, of 2002, all the military objectives were finished. We had utterly destroyed the Taliban. They were completely wiped out as an organization, political and military. The Al-Qaeda had been spread to the four winds, and to this day, they never fully recovered at all. So all of the military objectives were accomplished by, say, March of 2002. By that summer, by all rights, we should have withdrawn our military because there was no security environment that required military force and to allow the Afghans to start rebuilding their country. That's what we should have done and easily could have done. Even when I got there in 2005, the security environment was still very benign, so much so I could drive around the country in a pickup truck, not an armored vehicle, with no body armor, with no Kevlar helmet, any of that kind of stuff, and felt perfectly safe. Now, obviously, things deteriorated from there because instead of doing what made sense, you had first Bush turned it into a humanitarian operation, a nation building thing to bring democracy to Afghanistan. And then you had President Obama double down on that and made it even more of a humanitarian situation. Again, militarily unattainable missions. That's not, you can't accomplish democratizing a country with a rifle in your hand. It just doesn't work that way. It should be self-evident. So that's why I say this is a 20-year disaster in the making, and no one wanted to have the right mission. But now then we get to the end and this situation here, and should we have withdrawn? Should we have stayed? Okay, well, the decision was made. We're going to leave. So now Milley's saying he didn't want to leave. That's the bottom line. He didn't want to leave. So he thought that was a bad idea. He wanted to stay. So he recommended 2,500. Well, President Trump said, that's not what I agreed to. I agreed that we're going to withdraw. So that's what we're going to do. Here's the plan. So even according to Milley, both in September of 2021, when he went while he was still in uniform, and he again mentioned during this hearing today that on the 11th of November, he received a signed order that said the president of the United States wanted all American troops out of Afghanistan by the 15th of January, 2021. So 5 days before his term would end. That was the order he had. Now, I happen to know from somebody who was in the Trump administration who was directly working with this on the inside that when that order came out that Milley referred to, that he and then Acting Secretary of Defense Miller went to Trump and talked him out of it. And so you have this, this guy with all the stars and all the medals and stuff on his chest and Secretary of Defense, and they convinced Trump not to do it then, at least. And so the order was changed 6 days later to which he said today was by the O'Brien, then National Security Advisor, so that the troop number will be down to 2,500 by that date. Now, as it turned out, he subsequently said the number was down to 3,500. He never explained why they didn't obey the president's order even then, but they kept it at 3,500 instead of 2,500. Now, McKenzie, now when the new administration comes in, they're trying to talk Biden out of it. Don't do that. Now, what Biden should have done is said, okay, the order is that the Americans have agreed to the deal we have with the Taliban, that it's on the books, is that all Americans will be out by May 31st. All of them, not 2,500, but all of them will be out by then. The deal was, and this is crucial, that the Taliban had said, if you leave on the 31st of May as scheduled, then we're going to continue to abide by our agreement. We're not going to attack any American troops. No American troops died from the time that Trump made the deal in February of 2020 until he left office. So the Taliban lived up to their part of the bargain on the thing that mattered most to Americans, which was that they quit killing our people. Now then, if we stayed beyond that, they said, then that deal is off. And now we'll start attacking again. So now, when you hear Milley, and then in a few minutes, you're going to hear McKenzie again say, our recommendation was to keep it at 2,500. What you would have had then, and this is so important to point out, then the Taliban would have been back to a war with the United States. And guess what? 2,500 won't get that done. If we had stayed beyond that date and had said, we're not going to withdraw, as Biden subsequently did, he just changed the date, but he didn't say we're not going to do it. And the Taliban did give us that additional time. But if we had said, no, we're just going to stay at 2,500, like was recommended by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and by the four-star commander of CENTCOM, General McKenzie, we would have been back at war. And the only way you can conduct that is to escalate the number of troops back up, because that's not enough if you're having enemy contact. You have to have more than that for the country. So when you hear them say that they recommended that we stay at this level, they were recommending that we would have escalated the situation and remained at war with the Taliban with no end in sight. And we would still be fighting there to this day. That's what you need to take away from this hearing. If you don't take anything else away, if we'd have listened to their advice, instead of patting them on the back and saying they did a great job, we would still be at war to this day, and Americans would have still been dying at some frequency, who knows what. But it would have been pointless and unnecessary. Getting out was the right thing to do. The way we did it was terrible. But let's continue on here. Milley then says that that he's answering the question about the equipment that was left behind. Here's what he said.
As I recall, and I think it's laid out in the Seaguar's report, the special IG for Afghanistan, there's about 80 some odd billion dollars worth of military aid total. That's everything from food and building barracks and uniforms and boots to include equipment over 20 years.
Right.
And then he cites, I think it's 7.2 billion of military equipment, U.S. manufactured military equipment that is with the Afghan security forces. That's Afghan-owned equipment, not American equipment. Every piece of American equipment that the American military owned came out with us with Scott Miller, or he destroyed it on site.
Okay, it's important to understand here when you a lot of depending on which side of the political divide you come in, you either want to say, you know, this was a necessary thing to have left some equipment behind, or yeah, this is what you know, this was a mistake. This was a terrible thing that they did, and you know, it was a waste of money, and et cetera. Here's the truth of it. So now, originally in Trump's deal that he made, the Doha agreement, the U.S. military was going to withdraw by that date. So at that point, it was not a NEO. You may have heard that term used several times here. That's a non-combatant evacuation operation. Basically, all the civilians, all the American people who live there, you know, people who are working for aid agencies or in the embassy, all the Americans here, those are NEO, non-combatant emergency evacuation. Those were people who were living there, but in the original timeline, were not part of the withdrawal. So there was no plan made for that. It was just something that happened later on because the assumption was that there would still be an Afghan government and a military advice, so they wouldn't have had to have withdrawn. That's going to change here in a minute. We're going to see why that happens. But see, the equipment was supposed to stay behind because all that equipment that had been provided for years was for the Afghan military. So obviously, if our troops are going to withdraw, then we take our stuff with us. But all of the rest of it that we had provided for all those years was expected to stay and continue to be used by the Afghan military. So there wasn't a plan to withdraw that stuff, and nor should there have been the way the plan was set up. That had to change later on when the security environment disintegrated. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second here. The next thing is, then you had General McKenzie was asked another big question that comes up a lot. Should the U.S. have retained Bagram Air Base?
So my position on Bagram was it linked to my recommendation, my position then and now, that we should have held at 2,500. At 2,500 U.S. forces, if you also assume that will allow the Afghans to stay in the fight, you can maintain a viable base at Bagram.
No, you couldn't have. Because as he himself says elsewhere in testimony during this hearing, that if we had stayed there, then the Taliban would have ended their moratorium on attacking Americans, and we would have been back in combat. So you'd have had to have more troops. He also said when they were talking about could you have done the NEO and the evacuation from Bagram, would that have been better than Kabul airport? He said, well, here's the problem. And actually, Milley talked about this one. If you had used Bagram airport instead of Kabul airport, you would have had to secure it with, he said, probably about 4,000 to 5,000 troops to secure the whole thing. Now, if you don't know, my headquarters in the last portion, I was the Afghan Afghan chief for the Rapid Equipping Force in 2010, 2011. That was my job there. And I had three different headquarters throughout Afghanistan, but my main one was in Bagram. And Bagram was this massive place. It was huge. It was like a small city in Afghanistan. And it was just this bustling kind of thing. There was, a major airfield, helicopters, transport aircraft, lots of troops. It was massive in size. So it would have taken thousands of troops to secure that because basically it was kind of out in the middle of nowhere, which was good for security because you can have your perimeter security, which we had during the time I was there. And so nobody can approach it without being seen. So it gives you a lot of security. But if you're going to operate from there, you have to have those. Well, because we had gotten down to 2,500 with no expectation to keep any of the bases, it didn't make any sense to keep the base then. And again, because that NEO didn't come in until August. So when this drawdown started, Biden didn't make his final decision until April of 2021. So they're like, okay, we're on the timeline here, and we have every month you have to get closer and closer down, so that the last thing you do is leave from Kabul airport, with the expectation that they're going to leave an existing Afghan government and an existing military force behind, so that there would be security there. That was the plan. So unless you knew ahead of time that everything was going to collapse and that the security environment is 100 times harder in Kabul, where the Taliban were literally just in the buildings right outside the gate, and there was no security, where it would have obviously been easier in Bagram. Unless you had a crystal ball to know that, you would have not known to even suggest that. Because let me reiterate, the objective was military withdrawal of all of the bases by originally 11 September, or Biden's decision on the 11th September. That was the date that he had set. So there's no reason to keep Bagram then, because you're going to squeeze down to Kabul, and that was going to be your final location. That's why that didn't happen. So for him to go back now and say, well, I think we should have kept it at 25 then, and we could have kept Bagram Airfield, only if there wasn't going to be a withdrawal. And then as soon as there wasn't a withdrawal, then you would have had to add more troops. Now, I don't know if that was his intent all along, but I'm calling that out, because there was no path to keep 250,000 or 2,500 soldiers there, and keep Bagram and keep Kabul airports, and not be attacked by the Taliban. Those weren't options. And if that's what he thought, then his advice was terrible, because it's self-evident that those things, the math just doesn't work in any capacity, given the Taliban's claim that they were only withholding fire as long as we kept to our agreement. That's the bottom line. So you see here, we have seeds of the same reason for the disaster of this 20 years was evident in the withdrawal from the military perspective as well. Because instead of looking at things the way they actually were, and the unpleasant realities of things that were imposed upon us and the limitations, they chose to pretend like there was none, and we can still do whatever we want to without consequence. Well, there was consequence, as we saw graphically play out. Now then, let me move down to, yes, here we go. So General Milley was asked during the hearing, when did you feel like the tipping point came to where now it's like, oh man, this is not going to work out? Now, let me tell you, let me remind you before I show you this clip here, on September 21st of 2021, while still in uniform, Milley went before the Congress and said that nobody could have foreseen this. I mean, we could not have foreseen that the units would just disintegrate, that the government would fall apart. So we were all caught by surprise. That's what he said then. Now today, he was asked when he thought the tipping point came, and he said this.
The actual observable tipping point of the collapse of the Afghan military, et cetera, that clearly is in July. As you start looking at when provincial capitals start falling. The first provincial capital falls, I think it's 6 August, and then in the next 10 days, the rest of them start falling all the way to the capture of Kabul. But it's at the end of July, sort of right at the beginning of August, it becomes evident that the Afghan security forces are crumbling, and we are in it, and that's where the whole NEO thing comes up.
Okay, interesting point of view. What did he say at that time when he's claiming that it was now evident that it was going to fall apart and there was no more holding it out because the provincial capital started falling, et cetera? Then why in late July did he say this in the Pentagon?
The Afghan security forces have the capacity to sufficiently fight and defend their country, and we will continue to support the Afghan security forces where necessary in accordance with the guidance from the President and the Secretary of Defense. The future of Afghanistan is squarely in the hands of the Afghan people, and there are a range of possible outcomes in Afghanistan, and I want to emphasize repeatedly, and I've said this before, a negative outcome, a Taliban automatic military takeover, is not a foregone conclusion.
Really? Because that's not what you just said today. You said, yeah, it was clear by then, but now then you're telling everybody from the podium in late July, it is not a foregone conclusion. So which is it? Because they can't both be true. And look, we know for sure that he did not want to leave. He did not want to withdraw. He talked Trump out of withdrawing earlier, and as I said before, look, Trump's decision was right. Now, people can take issue with how he did it, talking to the Taliban, it's a terrorist organization, and all this. Many people have their views on that, but the bottom line is it was the right thing to do because the war was unwinnable. It would have been foolish to follow the advice. Trump gave the order on the 11th of November of 2020. Yes, 11th November of 2020. He gave the order for the full withdrawal. Miller, the then acting Secretary of Defense, and General Milley went and successfully talked Trump out of it. So Trump deserves some not credit, some blame for allowing them to talk him out of it. Had he done that, consider this. This is so important to make. Had Trump stayed firm and not listened to those guys and said, this is the deal we've made, this is the deal we're going to stick to, I want them out before I leave office, 15 January 2021, execute, move out. That's what he should have said. Had he done that, then the wheels that were already in motion up to that point would have continued on. The Pentagon had an obligation, an absolute obligation, no matter what Miller thought, no matter what General Milley thought, no matter what McKenzie thought, the civilian leader of the commander-in-chief gave an order. So no matter what your personal opinion is, which ironically, he said this elsewhere in his testimony today, you have to execute. So that meant that once the president gave him a date, they should have then been planning methodically. And I've been part of these in Afghanistan specifically, also in some in Germany when we've been drawing down units. You have this stuff planned out months in advance. You have all your logistics issues timed out. You have your transportation issues. You have your how you're going to dispose of equipment. All of those things are timelined out so that this has to be done by this day. This has to be done by this day, so that at the end everything is done. If that planning had been done properly, then this would have been over by the scheduled date by the 15th of January in 2021. We would have left in order. There would have still been an Afghan government. There would have still been an Afghan military because they would have been part of this process all along too. So they would have been knowing what was coming down. But it's crucial to understand at that time, the Taliban were not strong enough. They were not big enough yet. They were not well enough organized or equipped to be able to take over as they did. So if Milley had not imposed upon Trump and compelled him to change his mind, or convinced him rather, if Trump had been stronger, then we would have left in order, and there wouldn't have even been a neo evacuation because there would have still been security in Kabul. That's the truth of it. We should have been honest with the Afghan government even long before this. When Trump started talking to the Taliban, and these negotiations took, I believe, well over a year. That at that point, the Afghan government should have said, okay, the end is coming. It's going to become now. It's going to become later. Who knows when, but it is now has an end date. So we better start getting our house in order. We better start figuring this stuff out. The military better start figuring it out because there will be an end. I have heard so many people, and I think it was even mentioned a couple of times today, that we abandoned the Afghanistan, that we left them to their own. And of course they fell apart once that happened. That absolves them of all responsibility. And the Afghans have significant responsibility. We gave them 20 years of every opportunity in the world. We gave them billions and billions of dollars of reconstruction aid, of physical security. We spilled our blood for their benefit, of hundreds and thousands of Americans. Hundreds of thousands were wounded and hurt, and PTSD and traumatic brain injuries. We sacrificed a great deal for them. They had every obligation to take that and to use it to actually have a good country, to get rid of the culture, to at least minimize it to historical levels so that they can function. But they didn't do that. They did not take advantage of it. And apparently they thought that we weren't going to leave. I know that there was some rumors at the time, especially around the time that the election happened in the U.S., that some people were telling the Afghan people, don't worry about it. Once the new administration gets in, they'll undo all this. We're not leaving. And so instead of feeling a sense of urgency for the Afghans and not really getting their house in order, apparently they did nothing. So then when now Biden finally does make the call, now then they're like, oh crap, there's not much time left, and they're not ready. Their house is not in order. And so they bear a substantial responsibility, no matter what the Pentagon did or didn't do, no matter what Trump or Biden did or didn't do. The Afghan people, the government, and the military leaders have a substantial burden of responsibility for what they failed to do. Bottom line is there's a lot of blame to go around here. But what cannot be missed is that this war should have ended a long time ago. I argue that it should have ended in 2010, 2011, or 2012 at least. And every year after that, I continued to write that same thing. Any time during that period, whether it was Trump or Obama, well, it was eventually Biden, but during that time, they could have ended this in a very methodical, well-executed, well-planned way. They could have taken 18 months to do it instead of 6 months or something like that, so that everybody had plenty of time to mentally get their head wrapped around it. There were so many ways it could have been done right. But ending the war was the right thing to do because it was unwinnable. And if General Milley and McKenzie had their way, we would still be fighting there today. And I heard Jack Keane a week or so ago complain that it was that Biden was a disaster for getting out. No, it wasn't. The way he got out was bad, but his decision to leave, to follow what Trump had started, was absolutely right, because these people never want to quit fighting anywhere. Trump also tried to get us out of Syria. We're still there. Biden hasn't gotten us out of there. Troops have been killed for no reason. It's pointless, their deaths. Those that were killed in Jordan not long ago. There's more in there right now. Any day that there could be more troops added to that, because our military industrial capacity and our senior military leaders are freaking addicted to combat. They cannot give up any fighting anywhere, even if there's no reason for it. That's what just drives me crazy. Everybody's talking in this hearing here about how did Biden get out, not whether we should have, or should we still be there. And apparently they're still talking here right now. We may cut to some of that in just a second. But don't leave without understanding that getting out was the right answer, and that the way these people handled it to try and keep us in there was wrong. And much of the advice they gave cost men their lives. It cost America their credibility. That there is some truth to that, but it is not, Biden or Trump's fault alone. It is some of our senior military leaders. We're going to cut to a little bit of that, Gary, if you don't mind kind of bringing that up. Let's listen to a little of that. And if they say anything noteworthy here, I may make a commentary. We'll just stick with this here a little bit. We'll see how this works out.
Maintain a NEO plan that we've talked about before. We continue to refine our plan going forward to account for the reduced numbers.
Right. And of course, General Milley just testified to that a few minutes ago about his conversations with Secretary Esper and coming down to
That's correct.
The Christmas and then January number on the military side. So that implies then that upon being sworn into office, that President Biden and his advisors took the decision to get out completely. When was the first time, General Milley, that you were told that the president taking the decision that we're going to exit completely from a planning point of view, not the date you agreed to, but just from a planning point of view?
Yeah, that was, he announced it on the 14th. If my memory serves me right, I think I was informed on maybe the 11th.
Right.
Something like that, but it's just prior.
So upon that announcement, would you say that the Department of Defense and State began a coordinated effort to accomplish the goals of the June brief to President Trump? Or was there no effort to get, as you both talked about today numerous times, both departments, State having the preeminent role on exiting the nation, and DOD as a subordinate role?
It was a coordinated effort, coordinated interagency effort led by the National Security Council. And we did what's called a TTX, or a rock drill, a rehearsal of concept drill, on 8 May. And there were several of these type things. There was tons of coordination being done. But the fundamental flaw, the fundamental principle was the decision was to leave a diplomatic presence, leave the embassy there. And that is leaving an embassy in a war zone, while simultaneously withdrawing your military forces.
Okay, Gary, push that back to the minor. So there he's what he calls a rock drill. That's ROC. It's basically a rehearsal. He is admitting right there that they didn't do the coordination with State Department or any of these other people until May of 2021, even though the order had been given in February of 2021. Why did they wait until February 2020, like over a year earlier? That should have been done early in the process. I mean, even before Trump left office. So that tells you they never wanted to leave, and they did hope that the incoming Biden administration would not leave. So they did not take their action. By his own words, you just saw right there, his own words, that they didn't take the rehearsal actions that are coordinated until after we were already supposed to have left. So that tells you a lot right there. Go ahead. Let's run back there.
But on U.S. equipment, I'm talking about the equipment belonging, you testified a few minutes ago,
Oh,
the
there was some
distinction between, also Afghan government?
Some of it. Yeah, I'll let Frank talk to the details.
So the Afghans were using that equipment. So we, in order to allow them to use it, we didn't disable it. I would tell you at places like Kia at the airfield, where there was Afghan equipment there after we established the perimeter, we did in fact destroy all that equipment. It'll never be useful to anybody.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, to yield, I just want to announce the White House and congressional leaders have agreed to grant 12,000 special immigrant visas for Afghan nationals who assisted the United States. It will be in the State Department Foreign Operations Funding Bill. I think that was certainly supported by me and the ranking member as well.
I just want to say thank you, because it is something that we both support and we're working on. That's what I was talking about.
Can't say, hey, we left them behind, but we're not going to give them a visa to get out of there, right? Chair recognizes Mr. Mills. And thank you for your service getting Haitian Americans out of Haiti.
Well, it's an honor to be able to do this, to be able to help Americans out of Haiti, as we did with the 255 that we got out of Israel, and as we did with the
Okay, they're
Americans out
we're
of
starting to talk about
Afghanistan.
other
There's
issues
a
now.
pattern of
Gary, if we can
abandonment
pull
that
us
has
back out of here
existed
now.
throughout this administration that I
We're
want
going to
call
keep
attention to
monitoring
really
this, and if anything else gets said in the latter part of this that we need to bring to your attention over the next day or so, we're going to continue to do that. But just know that you can count on us to be unintimidated and uncompromised, monitoring this stuff. And when something's BS, we're going to call it for you. And when they say something's right, we're going to inform you of that too. All this, though, is to keep their leaders' feet to the fire. Now, one of the things that allegedly is going to come out of this, which I'm actually going to be on Fox News, Laura Ingraham, later tonight, if for those in the United States that want to watch that. And one of the things she wants to ask about is accountability. How come all these mistakes are made and all these people have been killed and all this disaster? How come nobody has been held account to this day? And that's something a lot of people are going to be asking. We're going to be asking that and continue to stay tuned. We'll see what happens with that. But for now, please like and subscribe. Thanks for joining us today. And we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.